kid, it was that, the glory of Jesus Christ
Right.
and how he shone in such a brightness
Yeah.
that was blinding to them
Right.
and that they fell down. And we always knew about Moses and Elijah. So
Jacob went up the ladder.
Went up the ladder, right, that's
Yeah.
Jacob's ladder, right.
that was a minimal teaching when I was a
Right.
kid.
That's what I
Jacob's ladder.
mean.
Right.
Is
That's what we.
none of it was
we were
really
told to teach.
explained this way.
I mean, I remember teaching my kids Jacob's ladder and, Jesus loves me and.
But if you would leave it at this level now, I would die.
Oh, yeah. We'd be moving on.
Well, and if I can just, I'll try to summarize it in terms of, the sort of the benchmarks you see in the Transfiguration. You have mountains, you have the prayer, you have
Night and day.
night and day, you have the disciples roused to the brightness of light, which brings us to Genesis. You have Old Testament law and Old Testament prophet and Moses and Elijah. You have the understanding of the tabernacle, but most specifically, if nothing more, Peter is articulating it as tents. You have God the Father speaking from heaven, in the same ways, in many ways, similar to what he did in the creation, that he's there creating faith. But in the creation of faith, it produces terror. But then in the production of terror, it serves as an antithesis almost to the understanding of human glory. So in other words, Jesus is pulling them forward, and like I mentioned yesterday, well, yes, he's pulling us forward, but we often think that he's pulling us forward to some sort of a mountaintop. Well, no, he's pulling us into the valley. Why is he pulling us into the valley? Because that's where we live. We are pulled into the valley. And it's the valley that then is once again tied to Psalm 23, which is one of the most beloved psalms that exists. So we're pulled into this valley of the shadow of death. Who's pulling us?
Ourselves.
Well, God is pulling us. And he's pulling us into the valley. The fact that it's a valley of the shadow of death is because of us.
That's true.
So we live in the valley, but the valley is filled as the shadow of death because of the sin that plagues us. See, there's so many discernments that have to be made as you go through these little stories. And they are stories, but they're also real.
But you see, pastors never thought the congregation was smart enough to get this.
Right.
Well,
That's why they didn't teach it.
but we're not, and that's the beauty of it, is that it's not about wisdom. It's about the fact that with the word, the Holy Spirit works to give faith.
But see, when I used to go to conferences and all this good stuff,
Yeah.
that they offered for us and the various classes.
Yeah.
And I'm talking back in Chattanooga, so it's not Germany. And the fact is, I want to make this clear. People always think I learned that over there. I didn't. And so it's there they teach you, because then they think, oh well, this is a group of people that wants to know more. But in general, pastors have really flunked out on teaching as deeply as you do.
Okay, so then
I agree.
is it because, and I would say that's an excuse, and I'm not saying that to throw anybody under the bus, is that, just the things that have been articulated already within the Transfiguration. Choose one of them and you could spend an hour alone, as we've discussed. I mean, as you've seen as we go through Jeremiah, and even the book, probably even more so in the book of Hebrews, because the book of Hebrews, like I mentioned before, I had consulted with other pastors that I trust and I know teach well. What is your suggestion? And they said, well, you better know the entirety of the Old Testament. Well, that's a really big deal. But that's also important because, as we talked about before, that this is being done ultimately specifically at Calvary to get us to the point where, and I thought this was kind of funny, I thought about this yesterday, that this is ultimately driving us toward, our examination of the book of Revelation, which at the beginning of the pandemic, people were just gaga about. Well, the pandemic's over. The pandemic's over. Okay? And so then is the interest still there with regard to the book of Revelation? Well, I'll leave it there for now, and then I'll insert my thoughts on that. So is the interest still there?
It's waning,
Okay.
probably.
Okay.
I know, talk to
Yes.
people that don't believe it.
Well, if you hear from other denominations, there is so much they
But it's,
bank on of Revelation and to put it in today's happenings and all this stuff.
They
It's just
put their
enough
own
to confuse
interpretation.
the rest of the world.
Yeah.
right,
So other thoughts on that?
I think there's a little bit there, but now they're waiting for the summer for the fires and the global warming stuff. The war to get here. Oh, yes, that's
that's the other thing, yeah, I was gonna say that, yeah.
Russia
Uh-huh.
and good one, Ukraine right now.
So what's being lost is the word of God in the scenarios that they're building.
Well, yeah, yes. What do you mean specifically?
Where do you put your trust?
Okay.
I have a cousin that she's preparing to go to a mountain and she's wants to get there before the end of the world so she can be saved.
Which mountain?
I have no clue.
We'll find out.
Apparently one somewhere in Idaho because that's where she lives. And if you're on a mountaintop, you're gonna get saved.
Too many movies.
Well.
Yeah.
And so this kind of
Interesting.
reaffirmed her, the world's going to hell and it's coming to an end and
Yeah, that Noah's coming back.
It doesn't matter how you die, it doesn't matter.
Ray?
Well, I hear a lot
but again,
about,
she says in God.
the end times are here,
Yeah. That's where-
and people are afraid.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes,
They're scared to death.
I agree.
They don't know which way to turn.
That's the problem.
Sharon says you need to go to the mountaintop.
Yeah. Well, and
Which
that's,
way to turn.
but that's also the wonder of transfiguration too, is that, okay, not only do we see it in Peter's epistle, we see it in Second Peter, which was read on the transfiguration on the 6th of February. Is that Peter will say, well, we have something more sure than even the visual evidence that was there, and that's the inspired word of God that's been given to us. And we were included in that. But Jesus is also making that clear as well, because and I lost my train of thought with regard to transfiguration. Oh, and I got it again. Is Matthew then writes is that okay, after Jesus touches them and speaks to them, fear not. Then all of a sudden, the brightness is gone. Moses and Elijah are nowhere to be seen. And then Matthew then expressly in Greek then says they saw Jesus alone. Meaning, like I said yesterday in the song that I apparently put in people's heads, they only had eyes for Jesus. And that's where we're at. I mean, we're in a spot now is the same as we've always been as a sinful people and a sinful creation. Or a sinful world, rather, is we're continuing to look for that fulfillment, acknowledgement, peace, or whatever, fill in the blank. We're looking for something. And in many ways, the world and our sinful flesh and the devil, all together, are able to provide us with some of those things in part. For example, a woman who is convinced to abort a child, she will be given freedom. Freedom from raising a child, freedom from economic burden. But it's not a gift, but it's presented as such a gift as to say, you will not have to worry about, you won't have to worry about taking the time to analyze whether or not you can afford the time or the money to raise this child. But it's temporary. It's temporary in the sense that it's long. It may be long lasting, because the reality is that once a child is murdered, that child's not going to be around. So you have that for your entire life. But what's often not talked about is what goes with that. Is that the freedom that Christ gives us? There's many differences, One, it's everlasting. Two, and this is really kind of the same thing, it never goes away. It's with us now, it will be with us forever. It's sure, it's certain, it's not based upon us in any way, shape, or form. And not only that, in receiving this freedom, and this is the thing that you're starting to hear in the rhetoric of how you're hearing it already in terms of freedom being a bad word. This isn't about Christianity, or it is about Christianity, but it's not necessarily about constitutional liberty and freedom. It's not about that. The devil's fingerprints are all over this.
I heard last night it's being called the new F word.
Sure.
I was watching news last night. Yeah.
And you know, this understanding that freedom is given to us as has been preached at Calvary. The freedom is given to us not by governments. The government is actually in a position of the law. In other words, they're there to make sure that there's punishment. There's punishment for anyone who transgresses that which would bestow freedom. But it's a little bit on its head right now. It's a little topsy-turvy. And you know, this is it's far wider reaching than even just the fact that, you know, in Canada, which if it can happen there, it can happen here, and probably soon will. That, you know, we look at it in terms of loss of livelihood, loss of access to our money, loss of access to the ability to come and go as we wish, whatever it happens to be. But it's far greater than that, because these are individuals who are actually presenting themselves in the positions of God.
And a lot of them are saying that. They're saying this goes far beyond mandates. It's the God-given freedom.
Right, and then that begins to it's manipulated, because in many ways, especially amongst Christians, but non-Christians alike, is they often associate God with just being God of power. So them seeking after power is to seek after one aspect of who God is, but then for us as Christians, that's why the cross is imperative.
Well, but they seek after power to accomplish what they want.
Right.
So that's just.
Whereas we look at it and say, how is it, this is why the glory of transfiguration is pointing forward to the glory of Golgotha. Which you look at that and you say, well, that's what?
Yeah, but that's why we say.
How is that glory? Well, it's glory in the sense that we see then how it is that our true priest goes to offer himself as the sacrifice and willingly dies on his throne for his people. And that's why it has been preached at Calvary. It doesn't matter if it's Justin Trudeau or Joe Biden or Donald Trump, you know, to the extent that these are individuals that would shed their blood for me, even then, it's the blood of men. But they're not willing to shed any of their own blood, but they sure seem willing to shed the blood of their own people. That is not freedom in its truest sense. And that is not liberty as we understand that it's been given to us and afforded by God. The great news is that while it can be taken away functionally, it can never be taken away from us in reality. It can't. So they throw us in prison. Well, guess where we're going to have church next? You know, it's no different. This is why the book of Daniel is such a wonder, as well as the book of Esther, along with all the different books of the Old Testament, is that, you know, God sends this, and everything that stood as fundamental institutions, so to speak, were taken away. There was no temple anymore. There was no place to go. There was no place for them to gather in any way, shape, or form. But yet God was still continuing to give to his people what they desperately needed. Even as we've been talking about in the book of Jeremiah, even as they are in the position where they are currently lamenting, where the people need to bring in professional mourners because they're not going to be able to wail enough. And even God himself says, oh, that my eyes were whatever, the ocean, that there were enough tears to cry over the reality of what it is that I see my people doing. And you know, along with that, for us as Christians, we do lament and mourn. And we lament and mourn not necessarily for any other reason than we apprehend that there are bad actors involved, bad kings that are involved, and scared people who are in a position that they're willing to do pretty much anything.
Here's the statement. Sabrina Rembrandt, there were pastors in Romania under the Nazis. And she said to her husband, the pastor, when they all met and the churches caved in, they were preaching what they were allowed to preach.
Mhm.
And so she says, go wipe the tears of Jesus' face. So she understood how he lamented
Mhm.
with what went on.
So when you say they caved in, you're not talking about physically. In other words,
Well,
they
no,
came
they
in.
were still allowed to, but you preach what the government tells you to preach.
So they caved in to
Yeah.
the dictates of.
Yeah. They were no longer, if I look back on what went on, no longer Christian churches, because I don't think they're in Germany now. The Lutheran church even.
Yeah.
To me, is no longer a Christian church,
Sure.
because they allow any and everything, and it's all hunky-dory, and.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. So, it's not to look at it to see it as in a dour way. I think it's being able to understand that what else would we expect? This is the very best men can offer. And it's very strange because ironically on the flip side of that, when we understand that within the realm of true liberty and freedom, that it is not compulsory, but then we are given the freedom and the liberty to serve one another. We're not commanded, but we are compelled simply because we have first been shown mercy to show mercy to our brothers and sisters and to our neighbor. So this isn't new. It's not the first time, and unless Christ comes again, it won't be the last. And it's different, but it's not. These are not the worst times ever. They're bad, but they're not the worst times ever.
It always amazed me that people in general are so satisfied with the gifts they get from men and what government can do from all this, and they can't see or all the every good and perfect gift scriptures that comes from the Heavenly Father.
Sure.
And they can't see it. Just how rich, all the riches of heaven. It's a kingdom for crying out loud.
Well,
Come to us.
But it's a strange thing that we look at that and we would, to the extent that we would perceive what is given to us by the state as a gift. Well, who's given that gift first?
Taxpayers.
Okay, so then,
And God gave it.
right, I think
gave it to the
if
taxpayer.
we convened as a Congress, I think we could probably figure out a way to spend other people's money. So they're not benevolent. They're presenting themselves as benevolent. And yet figuring out, wonderful ways, wonderful quote, air quotes, ways to be able to simply dispense what has already been given to them by us. But we don't understand that. It's our stuff.
I understand it.
Well, yeah.
There's a lot of other people that don't.
Right,
They
because
see it as a right.
yeah, and whether it's establishments of states of emergency, whatever it happens to be, and this is the thing, it's not just governments that do this, churches do this. They do this when somebody from the pulpit would decry, well, the end of the world is near, you've got to do something. It's presenting an emergency. That's why there's no alarm bells going off at Calvary. Yeah, this is normal. This is how the world is. And we're in a fabulous position as Christians to be able to apprehend that and say, well, why would we expect anything different? But yet, even in the midst of this, what and where, and I think this is the important thing too, what is God doing is best known by virtue of the scriptures. Where he's working is revealed to us within the scriptures. And this is the thing for those listening online or who are chiming in or maybe hearing this for the first time, is this is the only place that they're going to hear the truth. And it's not a truth of legality. It's not a truth necessarily of dogmatism in terms of get your life straightened out. We've presented this many times as the scriptures do. that the church is only a place for sinners. Only sinners need to show up here. Because the salve, the medicine that is given for sore sinners like me, can only be found in this place. And it's given abundant, far more than we could ever imagine or even ask. And I think that's the misnomer oftentimes, is that the church is not coming at it from any sort of position of superiority, but we're coming at it, Lord willing, from a position of humility. And that humility is that, okay, well, the world, it's like Isaiah says in chapter 6, is that, Isaiah it's revealed to him as he sees the very holiness of God. And we're certainly seeing that now. And it's veiled in the same way as it was when the seraphim were covering the glory of God. But it causes Isaiah to have the same response as Peter, James, and John do on the Mount of Transfiguration. Peter, James, and John fall down in reverent fear, but it's like we've talked about before, is that what you fear becomes your God. And yet they have this great fear of this God who's there on the mountain. The Father's voice booms from heaven. But then you immediately then see how he's inclined to his people. Not necessarily in the voice of the Father, but in the Son of the Father, the Son of Man, who then speaks words of comfort and then immediately touches them. So in other words, how quickly does the relief come? Just like that. They don't wait. They don't have to wait. And that's true today. February 5th, 16th is just the same as it was on the day of Transfiguration, as it will be until the last day. So we take great heart in apprehending, that while what we're seeing, and we're seeing a lot, but as we prepare to enter into Lent, that'll be the common theme, is don't trust what your eyes see. Don't trust what your eyes see. Because to the extent that you trust what your eyes see, it's one of the reasons why so few Christians attend the noon service or the Tenebrae service on Good Friday, because they can't bear to see the corpus. But if you don't see the corpus, then you can't see how merciful he is. If you can't see the corpus, you can't see that it should have been you that was there.
But used to Good Friday was the one day the churches were packed.
That's because
So what
people
happened?
got the day off. It was a holiday.
Yeah, absolutely.
And when they government took that away, it changed.
Well, but to be fair with that too, and I don't mean to be antagonistic with this, but yes, okay, yeah, so we can look at it and say it's been taken away, but what prevents a Christian from saying, I'm taking that day off?
Save a vacation day for that day.
And we begin to see here is that, as time is going forward, there's going to be more of this, not less.
Pastor, that was like coming from a restaurant family. I can remember on Good Friday, my parents were prepared to be swamped. From the time we opened till the time we closed, that restaurant was packed. That's where everybody spent Good Friday.
Yeah.
I mean, that's,
And it's not, we're not talking about it in any sort of, legalistic way. But, when you're looking at it, within the totality of Holy Week, that, to be able to take the time, and it's the same sort of thing as, so we know that right now, so we're gathering up small funds and meager, and it's good. I mean, it's good that we're starting them for the college stuff. We don't have any college kids currently, but we will in a number of years. That's right. We will, yes, as soon as next year. And so having this set aside, we're how do you say? We're given to be able to, we're given to a position to be able to understand the great opportunity we have to provide the care that is given to us within the church. And that's the beauty of that, is that, for a Christian church in the modern day, is that, well, then how is that done? And this is the same way as it worked with the different gifts that are articulated in the scriptures. Some are given to preach, some are did whatever it happens to be. It works the same in 2022. if I were to say to, you all, or open the opportunity and say, well, would you like to drive with me on that particular trip? Well, some of you might want to. Can't fit you all in the Corolla, but I mean, I can, but the reality is that, okay, are limitations with regard to your avocations, your vocations, does that then mean that you are not individuals whom the Lord has loved? Not at all. I mean, the Lord does, but there are ways to contribute to this, and then it then actually exists as a work for the neighbor that comes from the body of Christ. That's why we're asking for donations. Is simply that it may not be the possibility that everybody can go or to take that amount of time away, but I can. And it's not even time away. It's not considered time away. It's to say we're going deliberately to do what it is that happens here on a weekly basis. For kids that, maybe don't, and this is the other thing that I say to kids a lot of times, is that, okay, when you're considering what college you are going to the extent that children are still thinking about college, or even a job, or moving. There's a lot of people who have talked about moving over the last 2 years. To which then it's been presented to me as, well, good, wherever you go, then you have to find a good church. Because if you're going to Guam, as I've mentioned before, it doesn't have any Lutheran churches, you understand that understand what you may gain in certain things, but also consider what it is that you may lose. This is a long way to go back to the point, is to say, what do you miss? What is missed if we miss a Traore service on Good Friday, or what do we miss if we're not there for a Tenetary service? It's not to say that it's mandatory, but what do we miss?
And Jesus tells us to count the cost of discipleship.
Yeah.
It's not always that we just feel hunky-dory. It might hurt.
Oftentimes it does.
Yes.
And, it's...
And it might be hardship and all this.
Sure.
And then you look at our Savior and say, what did he go through for me? He wasn't guilty, I am.
And right. And yet we're set completely free from that, and not continuously plagued by. And that's the thing that's so important, is that, as we're looking at, and this is what we talked about in Jeremiah 7. Jeremiah 7 was a great chapter of talking about, well, what does the Christian life look like? Or even Jeremiah 3 for that matter. I mean, the Christian life is, in chapter 3, well, what have I required of you but that you repent of what I've told you you're doing? Hear me. And then Jeremiah 7 is talking about it in terms of okay, well, you continue to think that it's the work that you do. I'm telling you, through this Jeremiah, who's standing in the doorway of your temple, that it's not about what you do, how you burn incense, or how you sacrifice the animals. And to the extent that you think that it is, they are of no benefit in any way, shape, or form. As a matter of fact, you are putting yourself into the position of being God. Never mind the fact that there's also idolatry that's happening, and you're convening with these Canaanites and worshiping on the hilltops and sacrificing your children. It's not to say that the sacrificing of children is the worst. It's all bad. And that's like we talked about at the beginning of Jeremiah, is that Jeremiah is going to be, he wasn't liked. He cried a lot, but I think we begin to understand why. It's not because nobody heard him. He wasn't saying, well, gosh, nobody's listening to me. He was told nobody will listen to you. But he weeps because he sees the people that he loves being allowed to enter into the perdition which is sure. It's a strange place. And I think about it, for you as mothers and fathers, grandmothers and grandfathers, or just citizens of this country, is that we are watching in live action an entire country that is walking into perdition.
Right.
And it's right for us to weep, if we have the tears. If not, I'll have to look where the professional mourners are. Yeah. Well, and you think about it too, is like, and I for myself, I'll speak for myself, is that I haven't taken any time deliberately, in the times where maybe it strikes me. There's maybe been once, where, in that sanctuary, it was just a weeping. It's not to say that it was, but to be able to take that time to be able to, one, weep and lament, which is good and right, because we see what lament is used for. It's a cry that things are not as they should be. And two, that we understand that as we lament, as we cry, that we're not really crying alone, even though we're in that sanctuary all by ourselves. We know who abides with us. But then also as the children of God, as the mood strikes us, with one another. To not take away the opportunity for consolation for one another. Because I think the other thing that we're really missing in this is that, there is a common lament right now. There really is. But it's a common lament that's manifesting itself in ways that are really strange. Anger, vitriol, the shouting, whatever it happens to be. But I'd be interested in, I'm not a proponent, I'm not a psychologist in any way, shape, or form, but I'd be really interested as to see, how many people, they were given that opportunity, and to use this word properly, a true safe space where it's okay to be able to lament what's happening, and that place is here, but there's so much more that happens here. Like I said, that's just part of the story. So anyway, we're in good hands. We really are. And it's good, that we have Jeremiah's text, the word of the Lord given to us through the prophet Jeremiah, to remind us that as he's been faithful to them, as he laments with them, so he laments with us. So let's look at chapter 10. That's where I had that we left off last week. We're going to have to do a hard stop at the end of chapter 10 because I was able to flip through my notes and realize that I had about 5 pages of single-spaced notes that I had not looked at quite yet. So chapter 11 is very important. So we're going to wait until we get to next week because I want to give you the full thrust of what it is that our Lord is giving to us in that chapter. So we'll go through chapter 10, which should go by pretty quick today. That's why I've taken all this time just blabbing, is to kill a little bit of time. But if there's any questions as we go through, as we have to this point, we'll stop and consider them. So if somebody could read, let's kind of take it in 5 verse increments. Let's do verses 1 through 5. If somebody could read that, please.
Hear the word that the Lord speaks to you, O house of Israel, thus says the Lord. Learn not the way of the nations, nor be dismayed at the signs of the heavens, because the nations are dismayed at them. For the customs of the people are vanity. The tree from the forest is cut down and worked with an axe by the hands of a craftsman. They decorate it with silver and gold. They fasten it with hammer and nails, so that it cannot move. Their idols are like scarecrows in a cucumber field. When they cannot speak, they have to be carried, for they cannot walk. Do not be afraid of them, for they cannot do evil, neither is it in them to do good.
Oh man, that just really summarized it all.
That says it all right there.
Thank you for reading that.
I like
Such
that.
sweet gospel.
I like how it says cucumber.
I know.
Normally isn't it beet or?
I'm not
Yeah.
now.
Why?
Yeah.
Cucumber is so random.
Because you hear this, and it goes back to what was said, right? Is that as we look at what it is that what the world says that you should expect from the church, and Heather, you just read it. What the world says you should expect from the truth is that when you hear, "Thus saith the Lord," get buckled up. But then all of a sudden, by the time you get to verse 2, "Thus saith the Lord, do not learn the ways of the world. Do not be dismayed at the signs of heaven." The Gentiles are dismayed at them. In other words, so you see, it's like Chicken Little, right? They see all these things, and it's not just the world. We expect this of the world, but it's also remembering that, okay, well, what are the people of Canaan? What are the people who have followed these idols? they're going to start to think that these things that they're seeing in the heavens are signs of something more.
But that's what some of the denominations tell you today.
Exactly.
Same thing.
And that's why, once again, as Lutherans, to have it where we are buckled up in a sense is to say it's going to be a bumpy ride, but there are going to be people who are going to say, well, see this sign of the heaven? What was it, a couple months ago? You see, it's snowing on the mountains of Hawaii.
Oh, yeah.
Surely the end is near. Surely you're seeing that right now. Get yourself to a high place, a mountain, because then God will find you. Like I'm hidden. He knows me. And here's the strange thing. Why is it that a person who's maybe an unbeliever believes in some way, shape, or form that God could find them in their sins so they hide from them? But then when it comes to this idea of being holy, we think that we can raise ourselves up to it. But that's as old as sin itself. The Tower of Babel, the people of Judah, they believed they could build something up to get to
Speaking of a Tower of Babel, did you know that in Austria, in the scientists made a synthetic fetus, creating a baby?
Oh, yes.
A synthetic what, Jesus?
Fetus.
Fetus,
Fetus.
baby, yeah.
Creating the first step to creating their own mankind.
Yeah.
You didn't see the movie The Voice from Brazil?
No, I
No,
didn't.
what is that?
But I mean, this is the Tower of Babel.
Yeah.
You know.
Well, and if nothing more, I mean, what's the, whether it's AI, AGI, whatever it happens to be, we're wanting to create, I mean, there have been other world leaders that will remain unnamed that thought that they could create a perfect race. I'm just saying. There's nothing new under the sun. And so here you have this new advent of AI and AGI, which are good things and can be used for a number of good purposes. But what we're trying to create is nothing more than a superhuman. Who are we really trying to create? The guy who's already been here, who's with us now, namely Jesus. See, that's the beauty, is that we're not looking for him. He's found us. And yet he continually reveals himself, and this is the beauty of what was just read, is that he's revealing himself to the people, and he's saying, okay, do not be afraid of these things. But then going to verse 3, for the customs of the people are false, futile. I mean, they're as good as far as they go. You see this in Judah. And it's not, notice here that Yahweh is not saying, okay, well, their ways of trade are awful, and they need to work on a new economic system, and they really need to work on immigration and all this. That's not what he's talking about. The customs that these individuals have thought would grant them an opportunity to be closer to God are not working. So then goes to talk about this. We talked about it before with regard to the formulation and the building of idols. So, and this is the thing that's so strange about this. For the work of the hands of the workmen with the axe. But Heather, what did I like your translation a little bit better. Verse 3.
For the customs of the people are vanity. A tree from the forest is cut down and worked with an axe by the hands of the craftsman.
There you go. So it's not like, some kindergartner made these things. Which if you're a mother of a kindergartner, everything's cute. No, the idols are being fashioned by professionals. These are really good. But even they, although they decorate them, adorn them with silver and gold, they fasten them with nails and hammers so that it will not topple. They are upright like a palm tree, and they cannot speak. And here we begin to see what we've talked about before in the prophets before. They must be carried. They cannot go by themselves. So no matter how well they've been crafted, no matter how well by the grace of God, these Austrians who are probably really smart people,
They're going great.
will this fetus be able to walk or go by itself? Well, maybe it will. But even then, it's not what it is that God himself has, what God himself has manufactured.
But they won't have a soul. Right.
This is the one thing, that, is so
Just like
inherent as I've looked at the discussions about AI and AGI, is that fine. What we're looking for is, it's really Gnosticism. Okay, we talked about Gnosticism before, right? The ability to perfectly know something. Well, that's fine. So maybe we could know something. What's missing? Well, God is, and God knows everything, but that's only one aspect of who God is. But God knows everything and he cares. And that's the one thing that we're seeing right now with regard to these discussions of AI and then AGI. AI is just simply, bulk information, and I'm just giving a summary, is this bulk information where, for example, you go in to receive a lung scan, and AI is able to say, okay, Adam DeGroat's come in, he has this lung scan, and then in an instant you can have it, you can have the AI then compare it to 1,000 other scans. I like that idea. Because then the AI then can tell me, well, everything's all clear. Or you got a spot here, this is what it is that you have. Diagnostically, it's good. But then AGI then says, okay, it will then, and this is the problem right now, is they're not figuring out how it is that they can actually articulate, well, what actually is intelligence?
Is that artificial genetic intelligence?
I'm not sure what the G means. It's just to say, is AGI, AI is very much, and you see it. And I don't know how it works for y'all, but I think I gave the example of me and Alessandro the other day, getting ready for the Super Bowl, is we were ready to download Peacock TV. We were talking about it. Well, then Alessandro, who of course is from Sweden, his phone's from Sweden, his SIM card's from Sweden, an ad pops up on his phone. For what? Peacock. That is AI. There's no feeling in that. There's no care in any way, shape, or form. The algorithm just hears it and then is able to deliver the thing you're speaking of. But the AI doesn't care about you in any way, shape, or form. But AGI, and this is the problem that they're having right now, is, and this is where as Christians, we have a say in this, is that, okay, well, AGI, what would be the benefits of it? Can it and does it have the capacity to be able to exhibit intelligence with regard in the same capacity as human beings? But then that brings up some problems too, is to say, well, wait a second. We have a really hard time even understanding what human intelligence is.
Understanding each other.
So, yeah,
So why introduce yet another?
Well, but the thing is that it's the same sort of thing as what we've seen with regard to the advances in medicine. We would agree in many ways that the advances in medicine have been good. One of the things in this, we've talked about this, I've talked about this with the pastors ethically, is that's fine. It's good that people are living longer. But we've never really discussed what it will look like to care for somebody as they get to their old age. So in other words, as we've sped up, the reality is that, I don't know, if you're 80 years old, you don't quite move as fast as you used to when you were 18. So in other words, you can speed it up to a certain point, but it still takes a while for you to walk with grandma to the Smiths. You can't speed her up. And we haven't figured out a way, because that's the thing. We're set up with this understanding that things should be speedy, and then you start to see different things that come up as a result of that. Well, because it's chicken and egg, right? Do we look at it and say, well, we got to be able to provide grandma with an alternative because she's not quite moving as fast as she could have been before, so the best thing to do is just, put her out of her misery. Or then now grandma starts to think about this, and I've heard this many times, and if I ever hear you say this, I'm going to lambaste you. Okay, get ready. Well, I don't want to be a burden. Don't you ever say that to me.
Sounds like my mother.
Don't you ever say that.
Say that again.
I don't want to be a burden. Oh, well, wait a second. We're given as Christians to bear one another's what's. And to do so, understanding that Christ has borne the full burden of the weight of our sin. And I'll just use an example of this. There's somebody I know. I won't mention who she is that gave birth to me. But either way, Luther talks about this too in some ways. Most specifically, the highest office being that of a mother, and the great reality that as infants we would have died in our own filth. He uses a different word, but to die in our own filth if our mothers had not changed our diapers. And so then I would say, well, wait a second, because I hear that from this person sometimes, and I say, well, was it a burden to change my diaper? I said, what if I would have, as a 2-week-old baby, been able to say, I don't want to be a burden on me? And then all of a sudden things start to come into focus. It is a burden. And the reality is that it's a burden because we are in a fallen world that has effects that we would expect within a fallen world. I am slowing down as a 44-year-old much more than I was as an 18-year-old. And that's a good thing in some ways because, in more cognizant moments, I can say, well, gosh, God, it's really good that you've slowed me down because I'm not screwing up as quickly as I used to. Okay, right. I digress. It's just to say, well, it's very clear that even in the midst of this mess of the world of things that should not be, God is still right on time, giving me precisely what it is that I need. And not only that, has surrounded us, even as we age, to be able to bear whatever those burdens happen to be with one another until our natural death. And that's the beauty, is that, and incorporated into that is what it is that Heather just read, is that, okay, the world is telling you these are the things. But as Christians, we can look at it, and as the believers in Yahweh, most specifically Jesus, we are not to look at it, we don't see it in the same ways as the world sees it. That's the simplest way to put it.
Yeah.
And it's not to say that the destruction won't come. The destruction is coming. But in the midst of the destruction, we're going to see and lament, and they're already within this lament. This is part of the thing that they will lament, is that the people will continue to fall after these gods which can do nothing to save them. And how is that any different than February 16th, 2022? I don't see any difference at all.
It's the idol of the mask.
Is this understanding of unanimity or consensus, when the reality is God is saying, well, yes, there is a consensus of people who are going to fall into this, but I've come to you individually. You're part of the mass, but what we are losing and what we are at threat of losing is not just individuality, but individuality, liberty, and freedom. That's what's at danger. And that's how we know that the devil's fingerprints are all over this. Because he's stealing that away, not so that we can own 40 acres of a mule, but he's stealing us away ultimately that we will then be in subservient to a God who cannot do what they promised to do. That's just the way that it works. So we see that there. So let's continue on. Any other questions on those 5 verses?
I was going to say, I like the last verse. Do not be afraid of them.
For they can do no evil, nor can they do any. See, and that's the thing. Fear not that the one who can kill the body, but fear the one who can cast the soul into hell. Okay, and that understanding of fear is not bad. Because the fear of Peter, James, and John was not a bad fear. They rightly feared. But the other thing is there that it ends with is, but neither can they do any good. In other words, they're completely worthless. They're not good for being evil, and they're not good for being good.
So what's the sense?
And yet that's the thing, is that, having had that, we're made ready to be able to go out into the world, to be able to simply assess the rights, the state of it, but then to be able to understand that it's not necessarily that we have anything to give. I mean, we do, but Yahweh is giving it, and they are going to give it first. God is going to give it to them first, wherever they are gathered. And this is the sort of the blueprint of the church, right? I'm going to find you. I'm going to gather you up. I'm going to serve you. The divine will serve us. There it is. Divine serve us. And from that divine serve us, you're going to then go, as was mentioned previously in Jeremiah, is that there's going to be Gentiles that are going to be scattered around. And it's going to be to those Gentiles that you're going to go find. You'll find them. You're not going to seek them, but you'll find them. And in finding them, they will then be brought in, is what the promise that Jeremiah or Yahweh is making through Jeremiah. Okay? Other thoughts?
I always thought it was funny that Jonah was running. As if he could hide. He should know better.
Yeah.
But he should hide.
It's cute.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He's human.
Right. Yeah. Well, yeah, it's the hide and seek game of Genesis, right?
Yeah, and then after all this, he sits on a mountaintop, God throws a vine for him so he gets some shade, and that dies down.
Yeah.
It's just funny, the book is funny.
It is. Yeah,
What are you talking
right.
about?
Jonah. The book of Jonah.
Well, or streams drying up and ravens feeding people and then going and being sent into the desert and all these different, look what God is pulling him forward into. This is the wonderful thing is that, where it stands so in the face of the false prosperity of prosperity preachers. Because the reality, the Bible actually says, well, no, he's pulling you into the wilderness, actually. And it's there he's going to give you water and manna and quail. And it's there to the wilderness of this valley of the shadow of death, Peter, James, and John. I'm pulling you back down into the world where you live. And I'm going to die in the world by the hands of the people of the world for the sins of the world in order to overcome the world.
But you have to be in the world in order to, through him, overcome it.
Correct. And it's
You're not of it, but you're in it.
And it's the wonderful artistry that was there in the book of Hebrews, is that, okay, if it just existed as this council in heaven, well, whoopity-doo-dah. If there's not a ladder that the divine comes and goes down upon, now that's kind of a strange thing too, because it's not an actual ladder, and we realize that he's already come and he didn't use a ladder. How does he come from heaven and then find himself in the womb of Mary? But that is speaking of the word of God. So there's not an actual ladder. But Christ is coming down into this world still to dwell with us, to give us good things, and to lament with us the same as he always has. So that's the beauty, is that these things are, it's not even necessarily, I'd say, that they're constantly being repeated, as much as the Lord is continuing to remain steadfast. He is faithful, while we are faithless. But even though we are faithless, he gives us faith as he pulls us through, and constantly is giving us that faith, which believes and trusts not what we can see, but that which we hear. So that's what we're seeing here, is that, it's in essence, you look at it and say, well, don't trust what that you're going to see, because, by the way, the idols that they're going to build, that they're going to fashion, are going to be really good. They're going to be sturdy. They're not made by kindergartners. They're made by craftsmen. And, don't be fooled. So then let's continue on verses 6 through 10. Actually, let's do 6 through 11.
No one is like you, Lord. You are great, and your name is mighty in power. Who should not fear you, King of the nations? This is your due. Among all the wise leaders of the nations and in all their kingdoms, there is no one like you. They are all senseless and foolish. They are taught by worthless wooden idols. Hammered silver is brought from Tarshish and gold from Uphaz. What the craftsman and goldsmith have made is then dressed in blue and purple, all made by skilled workers. But the Lord is the true God. He is the living God, the eternal King. When he is angry, the earth trembles. The nations cannot endure his wrath. Tell them this: these gods who did not make the heavens and earth will perish from the earth and from under the heavens.
It's kind of the same
That's
thing.
good.
Kind of the same thing over
That's
again.
good.
Is once again, is who, even if it is fashioned by a craftsman, well, who's given the craftsman their skill?
God.
And yet even they have used their gift in a way that is nothing more to serve them, and to serve them to the extent that they're fashioning these idols, which they then, and it's kind of a funny thing because, verse 9, so they dressed them in blue and purple. Well, remember when Jesus is mocked when he's mocked? What color will we use and see for 6 weeks as we go through the season of Lent? Purple. And so it's not an adornment. We don't adorn our cross or our furniture with that purple because we're making them gods. We're not. But
when Jesus, in verse 10, that's opposite. When the earth trembles, when God put the wrath on Christ.
Yeah, and that's the beauty, is that it's not that he's coming. It's not that he's coming to appease the wrath so the wrath won't come, because the wrath is coming. But what matters is who it's poured out on. And remember, and don't lose touch with this, is that what's happening to the people of Judah is not wrath. It's punishment, but it's not wrath. Because remember, he said this many times before, I've come and I've chastised your sons lightly. I've beaten them, but I've done so lightly. Which means that he hasn't done what to them?
Killed them.
They're not dead. So, and the other thing too is that nor does God send them to be killed, because the reality is what Yahweh is doing is he's listening to them, and what he's saying is, it goes back, Jan, to what you had mentioned. They do not know how to do. What was it? There you go. Verse 5. They cannot do evil. They cannot do any good. But the reality is that their way is, and this goes back to the distinction made in the Garden of Eden: life, not life. Because their way is a way that leads to not life. It gives them life now, and it's abundant life. Things are well in Judah, but now things are not well in Judah, and so they begin to then say. They begin to look at it and they're resigned to the fact that death is all, and we've seen this before in the book of Jeremiah, is they think that death is the only solution. But yet Yahweh continues to tell them, well, no, death is never the solution. Though death is going to come, it's going to come by virtue of these ways that you have been given over to. And yet there is life that I'm still going to be giving you as you continue to travail through these things. It's pretty amazing how it is that Yahweh through Jeremiah is presenting this, that, we remember and recall that Yahweh has been very specific, and he says, he doesn't say in Jeremiah, all of you or everyone. He says, this generation. This generation.
Right, other text, it says he always reserves a remnant.
Correct.
His people, so it's not all of them.
Right.
Ever.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's the other thing to remember too, is that, there are a lot of them that are going to die. And they're going to die because God is giving them over to their gods. But their gods can't save them. And that's the thing to remember, is that their gods cannot save them from temporal death, but even worse than that, their gods cannot save them from eternal death.
Pastor, can you imagine if there was, say, this is an example, if there was ever something written about this generation for generations to come, if there is such a thing,
Mm-hmm.
Can you imagine what would be said?
Well, but
Here.
you're talking about specifically this generation we're in.
But I'm saying, if someone were to write something now, saying what they're saying in the Bible now, in here, imagine what would be written about this generation.
I think it would be much the same.
It would be the same, but can you imagine the other things they could add to it? About all the.
Well, but in terms of, it goes back to Psalm 119, is that in Psalm 119 is, oh Lord, if you should mark iniquity, who could stand? But with you there is mercy and forgiveness, etc. Okay. In other words, that particular part of the Psalms is saying simply, well, the amount, the types, the rapidity, or the quickness with which we the scriptures are very clear about this. Where we heard this last Sunday is that Paul is articulating this in reference to the Old Testament. He's saying their feet are quick to do evil. So in other words, whatever evil it happens to be matters not, or even the amount of the evil that's being done. Because regardless of this, and I remember it was Naomichi Misaki who had talked about this, and it's very important for us to hear it, but it's very important for people who have never heard this before to hear, well, did Jesus really die for all my sins? Yes, all of them. And not especially the ones that you really want to hold fast to, but even those. He's come to take upon himself and to put them to death. And once again, that's why the corpus on the cross is so important, is that not only do I see what should have been me, not only do I understand wrath as has been articulated in verse 10, but I see that the wrath is being poured out, but not upon me. That is imperative. Is that, and that's, and you guys know I've beaten that horse dead. And maybe until we have a, big 12-foot crucifix in the front of Calvary, then I'll stop talking. But
I'll go for it.
right. No, but I jest. It's to say, it's not necessary we have it, but it in the same way as purple during Lent adorns it and reminds us of what happens in Jeremiah. It's there, and it's good to remind us of who Christ is and what he does for us. So, questions on those or any statements on those 6 verses? Okay, let's do 12. Let's do 12 through 20. Let's take a big chunk here.
It is he who made the earth by his power, who established the world by his wisdom, and by his understanding stretched out the heavens. When he utters his voice, there is a tumult of waters in the heavens, and he makes the mist rise from the ends of the earth. He makes lightnings for the rain, and he brings forth the wind from the storehouses. Every man is stupid and without knowledge. Every goldsmith is put to shame by his idols, for his images are false, and there is no breath in them. They are worthless, a work of delusion. At the time of their punishment they shall perish. Not like these is he who is the portion of Jacob, for he is the one who formed all things, and Israel is the tribe of his inheritance. The Lord of hosts is his name. Gather up your bundle from the ground, O you who dwell under siege. For thus says the Lord, behold, I am slinging out the inhabitants of the land at this time, and I will bring distress on them, and they may feel it. Woe is me because of my hurt. My wound is grievous, but I said, truly this is affliction, and I must bear it. My tent is destroyed, and all my cords are broken. My children have gone from me, and they are not. There is no one to spread my tent again, and to set up my curtains.
Well, there's so much in there.
We were just called stupid.
Yeah,
I would love it.
hilariously, right?
I don't get that my children have gone from me and they are not.
Well, it's in a sense is to say, I've made them my children. They've told me they're not. They're the children, they say, of another, and they've given themselves over to another father.
Okay.
I'm still their father, but they are wanting to be led by a different father. The reality then of the reality of that father is he appears gracious and he appears wonderful and he's probably really handsome and he's made by a craftsman, right? He looks like Justin Trudeau. Sorry. He's really handsome. But look how that father treats his people.
Right, they're not listening to me.
Beauty is as beauty does.
Right.
Okay, so in other words, don't be enamored by the beauty. By it, because these fathers will whip you and they will beat you and they will kill you.
With Justin Trudeau, go back to 2013 when he was in front of a bunch of women and admired the dictatorship of China.
Sure. Well, and once again, and to be able to say here is that this that's the answer, Norma, to the question of the children. My children have gone off. Verse 16, we see Jesus, the portion of Jacob. Well, who's that? Well, it's Jesus. He is the maker of all things. Israel is the tribe of his inheritance. The Lord of hosts is his name, and specifically speaking in the Hebrew, it's the Lord of armies. He's the Lord of armies, and that's his name. In other words, what's in a name is what he does. So he's the Lord of armies, and there is none who stand against him. That's the point. Now, do the people understand this? Well, no, they don't understand this because they've seen strength manifested by the fathers that they have fallen after. In other words, his strength is known. His strength is known ironically, well, not ironically, his strength is known in what's perceived as weakness. I've given you a temple. I've given you this wonderful word. I've given you these sacrifices. I've given you mercy. I've called you out of your sin, and I've told you that I've given you mercy and forgiveness. It's perceived as weakness. Whereas the armies of that time were powerful. But that's the other thing that's so strange is that, okay, yet in their perceived strength, remember a couple of chapters ago where it then says, well, the earth is shaking because the armies of Babylon are damned. So that's both a physical trembling, but it's also an emotional trembling. The reality is you know, it's kind of like the little kid in grade school that acts really tough. He has to act this way because in reality he knows he's not. And so too, these children are there. They're following after these fathers that can do nothing for them. Other things on those verses.
Well, to me, the beginning that Sandy read, that's creation. He is telling who their living God is because he created everything.
Yeah.
Right.
Goes down to the flood too.
Yeah.
You know, so.
Yeah.
Well,
He's going through this whole
also, it
section of
seems like the
Genesis.
seed of man at this point in time. They think in the name of environment, they can control the heavens. They can control the weather, the earth. They're making fetuses now.
Right.
They think that they can do better than God does. They think that they can better control it. They can make it better than God did.
Sure.
Surely we can make a human that's going to be better than what
Yeah.
exists now. It's just such colossal conceit.
Yeah.
Right.
And I laugh when people say, well, you know, if we do this and this and this, the winds won't come and the snow will stop and this will. You can't control the heavens. You can't control the weather, the earth, you know. God does that. And nobody ever says, but God is in control. The politicians think they are, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Conceit.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Verse 19, woe is me for my hurt. My wound is severe, but I say truly, this is an infirmity and I must bear it. And that's the thing. That's an allusion, of course, to Christ. What is the infirmity he bears? He bears the sins of the world and he bears them under wrath and death. I must bear it. And you then see the connection to Jesus in the Jordan River, where John says to him, well, why? Why does this have to be? Well, it is to fulfill all righteousness. It's exactly what Jeremiah has been saying. It must be done. And there's only one who can, and he must. And that's the beauty then as we get to Good Friday, is to remember, you know, and I remember when I was first took hold of me, is that Jesus, you know, Jesus is on the cross, not unwillingly, but willingly. He put himself there for the very express purpose of doing and fulfilling exactly what all the prophets and the law have foretold would happen. Okay? Thank you, ladies, for reading on those. So then let's continue on, and we're almost to the end, I guess. Let's do 21 through 25.
For the shepherds are stupid and do not inquire of the Lord. Therefore they have not prospered. They have not prospered, and all their flock is scattered. Hark a rumor, behold, it comes, a great commotion out of the north country, to make the cities of Judah a desolation, a lair of jackals. I know, O Lord, that the way of man is not in himself, and that it is not in man who walks to direct his steps. Correct me, O Lord, but in just measure, not in thy anger, lest thou bring me nothing. Pour out thy wrath upon the nations that know thee not, and upon the peoples that call not on the name. For they have devoured Jacob, they have devoured him and consumed him, and have laid waste in habitation.
Okay. Well, there you go. Rainbows, sunshine, and stupidness. You know, and it's so the people are stupid, and the shepherds, the priests are stupid, and not only that, but you know, now everybody's scattered around here and here, there, and everywhere. And you know, the noise of the report has come, A great commotion out of the north country. That's once again it's a reference to the Babylonians who are on their way. And then the other thing, verse 23, the words, these words are not about people understanding God's ways, but about their ability to control their own destiny. And so the other thing to remember too is that, this sounds very, well, how does that sound? Well, Lord, I know the way of man is not in himself. It is not in man who walks to direct his own steps. Your translations are probably a little bit more clear on that. But this is a merciful proclamation. Because what's Yahweh saying?
We don't know what's good for us.
We don't know what's good for us, right? Yeah. And not only that, I'm not going to twist your arm. I'm not going to bend your elbow. I'm not going to make you cry out uncle. And I think that's the thing that most people need to understand is that, he is not going to come and force us in any way, shape, or form. But he will weep and lament as he watches his own people walk into perdition. And I can't even imagine. I do, and I can, and I have, and I think you have seen it too. And I remember, just let's talk about it on a small scale and then maybe a grand scale. When I was a kid, all the recess teachers were tyrants because they didn't want me jumping out of the swing. You can hurt yourself, kid. It's like the Red Ryder BB gun. You shoot your eye out, right?
Sure.
So it never happened to me, but then I was pushing my sister once in the swing, and she didn't quite know how to do that because she actually listened to the playground teachers. So then I was telling her to jump out like good big brothers do, and she got her arm caught in the chain and broke her arm. Whatever, she got it.
That's why you have trouble with her.
Right. So it's to understand. It's like, okay, and then beginning to be able to see. It's like, wow. It's not that the full weight of God comes down on 12-year-old Adam at the time, but you begin to see it, and you see it also as like in many and various ways in your own lives. Is that children you've raised in the faith that go off to whatever, who knows what.
Worship the devil.
Whatever, worship the devil, or they're fine and suited to adopt any number of different things.
Yeah.
It's not to say. I think once again that theme of lament is very clear. Is that okay? Once again, woe is me for my hurt, my wound is severe. But I say truly, this is an infirmity, and I will bear it. And I think that's the wonderful consolation we have specifically in this chapter, is that here we have God the Father speaking this through the voice of Jeremiah. Both are lamenting, and you begin to see the great hurt that's there. Not because God's feelings are hurt. He's not petty like this.
In verse 25, is that Jeremiah speaking? Pour out your wrath on the nations that know you not.
It's the answer to that is yes.
Okay.
It's both, right? Because Jeremiah is a prophet of whom? Of God. It's the same thing as when Mary says, listen to him. It's easier to see, and this is why it's a good kind of a segue to how we began, is to say, well, it's easy to see it. Jesus is there with the Father. They hear this voice from heaven, and yet here's the strange thing. Okay, and I'll present it by way of multiple choice question. Well, who do the people listen most to? Mary or the Father? Or C, neither?
See?
There you go. It doesn't matter who's speaking. God the Father, Mary, Jeremiah, whoever it happens to be, it's exactly the fulfillment of what Yahweh has said. They're not going to listen to you. So it is both. You have the Father weeping, you have Yahweh weeping, you have the prophet weeping, and they're weeping simply because once again, it's a proper lament. Things are not as they should be, but then we start to see what the should is. The should is articulated then back in, there's my 5 pages I gotta look at. The should is articulated in verse 19. Woe is to me for my hurt. My wound is severe. But then the last line is where we see the fulfillment of what the should be. I will bear it. I bear it now. I will bear it tomorrow. I will bear it tomorrow with you. I'm not going to leave you, but ultimately it's going to be borne once and for all. And it's going to be borne once and for all for you, for your people, this remnant and the children of this remnant, and unto all generations until the end of time, that there would be given this true liberty and this true freedom that is given through the forgiveness of sins. That will be given until the eternity that He's won for us in heaven. It's very complete in terms of how it is that the prophet is articulating what it is that God the Father, Yahweh specifically, would have His people hear. And that goes back to the Gospels, is that, okay, the sheep know the voice of the shepherd. My people, my sheep hear my voice. But then Sandy, and it's been in the last two, how did you get so lucky as to be able to say stupid twice? That's kind of fun, isn't it?
It
Right?
is. My mom would be, I touch you
Right?
better than that.
But remember, what's one of the hallmarks of sheep?
Stupid.
They're really stupid.
Stupid.
Okay, but the sheep have a good shepherd. And so you begin, once again, that fancy $5 theological P word, perspicuity. This perspicuity of Scripture is that this reference to being stupid is not a reference necessarily just to sheep, but it's a reference with regard to who we are as we've fallen after these bad fathers who are not treating us as sons. Because once again, in that language of sons is not misogynistic, it's language of inheritance. They're not acting as my sons, but they're acting as sons of another. And so they then will have, and you'll see this in the other prophets, is that, as it talked about, where it talks about, and Jeremiah talked about it too. Well, what are these people like? Well, they're like a harlot who just can't get enough of harlotry. So much so that she looks for others to be harloted by, to the point that they will then have their way with her. And then this then goes into, it's really repeating a lot of the same things over and over again. If you don't understand this language of harlots and prostitutes, well, maybe you'll understand it when I say you have a father who's going to beat the living out of you.
But didn't Jesus say that in a way when the Pharisees and scribes said, Abraham is their father, and He said, if you would know Abraham, you would know my father.
Right.
And so therefore, they're no longer were heirs.
Right.
In that text.
Well, they claimed a lineage. They claimed a lineage by virtue of genealogy and lineage, but lineage that has to do with birth, as opposed to this lineage that Christ is going to be bestowing by virtue of new birth, which is going to be understood most specifically in the new birth that comes by virtue of the new circumcision, baptism. And so, as we've talked about, this is why Hebrews is so wonderful. These shadows and forms and types and whatever it happens to be are all pointing forward to where it is that Christ is going to bestow these wonderful gifts. We're going to see them visibly, and we're going to see them visibly in the establishment of the church, most specifically in the beginning of the book of Acts, all the way until the end when Christ comes back to claim His bride, us, on the last day. And that's the beauty, is that, there is no, and this is where the Roman Catholics kind of get it right in some ways. The problem with the Roman Catholics is their use of the word "the," meaning there's no salvation outside of the Catholic Church. We agree with that. But we don't agree with the Roman Catholic Church. We believe that it is the Catholic Church, universal. That's congruent with what it is that Yahweh is saying for Jew and Gentile. That is Catholic. It's true Catholic in the sense in that everyone will be given entrance into this holy place, to be given the gifts that they themselves cannot produce.
I find it interesting. Chemnitz in a footnote.
Yeah.
For 23 and 24, he's saying, it is not in man's power, even when he has heard the word. See, we think begot the paradigm, to undertake any spiritual movements unless God, through his spirit, teaches him inwardly. So in other words, it has to come from God within you.
Yeah, and yes, I mean, it's operative in that is it must come from outside. That fancy Latin word extra nos, outside of us. It comes from outside of us and then does something with our insides. I mean,
But the word, it's hearing, so it's from the outside.
correct. Right. And that's why, I get so ornery when I say Jesus is in our heart, or when I hear Jesus is in our heart. Like, I'm ornery. Yes, maybe, but I don't even know. It's like, I'd like to see what the CAT scan looked like on my baptismal day, prior to baptism and then after baptism. Right? Because I'm not sure there would be any noticeable difference. If only we had AI back then, they'd be able to scan me. But
You're so human.
I know, right? Right. It's just to say, that it does come from outside of us and it does something far beyond what we can imagine. Not just in terms of the changing of our countenance, but in the sense that it gives us joy and peace and all these wonderful things. But also the reality is that, what Christ's death and resurrection does is it actually overcomes death, and Christ now has made this world his footstool. And so it's articulated, we see it in its totality in the resurrection of our Lord. But the reality is also true, that even you think about this, it's such a crazy thing to think about, is that, let me phrase it in this way. Even the Babylon, remember the other day when we were talking about the wind and the waves, listening better? The Babylonians are listening better even than the people of Judah. How?
They built the tower.
Well, the Babylonians.
They thought they were on a mission.
But Babylon here has listened. Well, there's a place down south to conquer. They're listening. They don't know who's saying it. They don't know why, whatever it happens to be. They've got their own ways that they're, But regardless, it's not. And then this is why when we go into the book of Isaiah, it was so important to understand is that, okay, it's not like the Medes just all of a sudden sat up one day and said, well, I think we're going to take over. Well, there has to be some inspiration for them to go to do this. And we're not going to give them as much credit as to say, well, they hatched the plan themselves. Any more than we give any of the tyrants of our own day any of the credit themselves, because it's not them. Because their ways are only wicked. They're inclined to it, they come by it naturally. But if nothing more, is it their own sinful flesh? Is it the world and the ways of the world? Is it the devil himself? Well, yes, it's any number of those different things. And yet as Christians, and this is the other thing to remember for us too, is that, to be able to understand that, that our desire for these individuals that are acting in nefarious ways is that the mercy of the Lord would be upon them. That's why in the prayers of the church we pray as we do. Is, you, Lord, you are the one that has given all these positions, these offices of authority. You have placed these particular persons into these positions. So to open their heart, be merciful to them, to guide them, that they would govern in a way that is pleasing in your sight. And when they don't, it's not surprise, my goodness, how could that have happened? It's just to say, well, it's clear right now that God is very much in the same way. He's giving them over as much as he did in the days of the fall, prior to the fall of Jerusalem. He's giving them over to their false ways and fathers that are not merciful. And we'll get to be witnesses of that. But although we're witnesses of this creation falling further into perdition, it's not necessarily that that we're reveling in the fact that we're lifted above it, but that we're protected while we're in the midst of it. And I think that's where the most comfort happens, is that it's exactly what's being said here is that, okay, well, really, what is it that man can do to me? Kill me? Fine. I know where I'm going. And this is one of the things that, and it goes back to this before, and I want to juxtapose it real quickly to the Muslims, is there was an explosion in the Muslim faith post 9/11. Why? They actually did a study on this. Why was there an explosion in the Muslim faith after 9/11?
In our nation, you're talking about.
Well, in the world.
People thought they were strong?
Okay, why? And this goes back to why it is you saw such growth within the Christian church after the age of martyrs.
Because the name is out there.
Okay, well, maybe, yeah.
They think that
Because they
they're,
killed so many people and that's their way to martyrdom.
Yeah, so there you go. And so, you look at it and say, it's not that they looked at it in terms of the power, but they looked at it and saw that these were individuals that were staunch in what they believed and were not afraid of death.
Right. What was their assurance into their
Assurance, yes.
That's why the Muslim faith grew. And it's a strange
Like a
thing.
handful of terrorists,
What's that?
are you talking about the terrorists that were in the airplanes?
Well, I'm just talking about the growth of the Muslim religion in general. Is it grows because individuals begin to see in a world that is absent of any sort of principle. And a world that it fundamentally, this is ultimately where we end up in the book of Hebrews, is the one hallmark of Christians throughout all time. And I would say amongst many Orthodox Christians still today, is that the common hallmark of every Orthodox Christian is that they do not fear death. Now, it's very different. I mean, there's not an advocacy in any way, shape, or form for the methods or the teaching that falls behind the Muslim faith. We don't believe that. And that's what makes the age of the martyrs prior to the explosion of the birth and the growth of the Christian church, specifically after Constantine legalizes Christianity. Christianity doesn't grow because Constantine legalizes Christianity. It grows because individuals have realized these persons have died of no fault of their own as victims of individuals who have killed them simply because of what they believed.
well, also Muslims believe too that you're a martyr.
Yes, and we would use that same language, is to say, well, we're martyrs, but we're martyrs in terms of the actual definition of that term, witnesses. I mean, that our witness, and this goes back, Louise, to what you had said, is that, okay, well, wait, I mean, Lord willing, I don't think any of us as Christians wake up and say, well, gosh, Lord, make me a good witness today. I mean, I understand what the implications of that are. We don't need to be martyred in order to be saved. We don't. We are witnesses simply by virtue of like we've talked about before, all a witness does in a trial is just simply say, well, this is what I've heard and what I've seen. That's what being a witness is. That's being a martyr. And we, who knows? I mean, maybe we are on the doorstep again of the age of martyrdom. I hope not. But if we've learned anything with regard to the history of the Christian church, is that the church grows. The church grows in the age of martyrdom. It always does.
It's stronger.
And it's refined. And it's like I said. I mean, it's not to end necessarily on a dour note, but it's just to say, that it's not zealousness, because there's a fine line between Christians and Muslims, in the sense that I would say that Muslims are far more likely to be rightly chastised as being zealots.
That's an understatement.
And it's not to say that their belief is not strong. It is. It is ferociously strong.
Right.
But then that's where we have an understanding, and we have one that's preceded us in that. Most specifically, I mean, St. Paul was, I wouldn't say he was a zealot in any way, shape, or form. Paul was one who was able to go to individuals, and zealotry is just to say you can have a zealotry with regard to any staunch belief.
It wasn't Peter, because he carried not a sword, the long one, but whatever, a dagger. He wasn't supposed to, but the zealots did.
Right.
So,
And so, it's climate change zealots, it's equality or equity zealots, and the zealots are all over. I mean, and we're starting to realize these are actually individuals who would be willing to die for this. But probably not die themselves, probably put us to death first.
Right.
But, it's just a sword.
hopefully it's short.
Yeah, and that's then the crazy thing is you hear this, is that, I mean, Jesus references it with regard to his disciples, and I'm not. He references the disciples when the Pharisees are telling him, "Well, shut those guys up." And he says, "Well, even if they were silenced, the stones would cry out." Or you then think about it as the text that often gets overlooked, because it's celebrated on December 26th. December 26th, what's important about December 26th in the church year? I have failed you.
Mm-hmm.
The slaughter of the innocents.
Already.
Oh.
The slaughter of the innocents.
Mm-hmm.
And so then what we then see as a result of that is that the blood of the martyrs cries out. In other words, what testifies? Blood. And it's the blood that they have not shed that blood for their salvation. But they've shed their blood just the same as the Lord has shed his blood. And that's the strange thing, is that, what exists then as the witness of that, and Jesus will talk about this. What exists is the standout witness of who Christ is. The blood. And once again, here I go again, beating the dead horse. That's why the crucifix is so important. Because from that crucifix comes the blood and the water. It all is connected. And it's not that the Christian church is just, they're not making this stuff up.
But the only reason you don't see it in the Lutheran churches, you always have the empty cross, because they were going to be like the Catholics.
Right.
That's all. It's just a denominational stable. Right?
I always look at that and I say, why does the Catholics get that all the pretty stuff?
Yeah, well,
I mean, but
they have the money.
yeah, they do. So,
Right.
Yeah.
Put a block box out on the corner.
yeah,
Sell indulgences.
I like that.
yeah, I had that a lot when we were in the valley.
Some suggestions to the council.
I go visit people at the retirement home, and
They'll be putting,
they'd all offer me money.
they'll be putting ballots in it.
Yeah.
Well,
Bad.
in the one advantage we don't have a Vatican that everybody can come back and say, what store in the Vatican? All these, this, that, and whatever, all this ancient stuff, there's all these rumors. We like to learn about that.
Well, Brian, do you have a suggestion or do you disagree?
Yeah, I know. I considered it for a second, and I'm like, I just filed my taxes. I don't even know how I report that accurately.
Well, I got it.
Yeah, we got our state return already.
Yeah.
We filed.
Filed electronically.
Yep.
Wow.
We filed